Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome and thank you. And I must say, I'm Ritu Menon, and of course, this is our speaker for the day, Aruna Roy, whom everybody knows. I just want to say that it is a very great pleasure to be sitting here with this wall of books behind one, because that's, of course, what we're all about, and that's what everyone is here to participate in. Um, it is my very, very great pleasure to be here today with Aruna, who is not only someone for whom I have enormous respect and very great regard, but is also a friend and someone whom I have known and whose work I have been familiar with for the last 4 decades at least. It's a very long time. And these are very long journeys that she has taken and I have taken to a much smaller extent. But in some senses, these are also overlapping journeys. And so I would like to speak to her today about not just her book, which of course is a very important and a very moving document, but about the journey itself. Aruna's has been an unusual journey because it was a journey in reverse from, um, from a status of potential power as a civil servant to a life of apparent powerlessness as an NGO. Any of us and all of us who have been in that sector know that it is fragile and it is precarious, even as its impact is enormous. So that journey that she made in reverse was, and I'm just giving a little bit of background for those of you who may not be as familiar with it. That journey in reverse was taken over the decades of the mid 70s and 80s, beginning then, which was a very interesting time in the country because it saw the emergence and the significance of many civil society organizations, not just of NGOs and non-government organizations, but of civil society organizations that actually made it their work and made it their commitment to work for civil and political rights, for human rights, for women's rights, and democratic rights. Aruna is unique because her work has cut across all. So, democratic, civil and political, women's rights, human rights, and ultimately uh, the right to dignity and labor. She's unusual because most of us who work uh, in civil society organizations tend to focus on one or the other. Not surprising because energy is limited. But she is remarkable for having spread herself not thinly but extremely effectively across all these. And it is, of course, in recognition of that that she has been awarded and she has not just been awarded, she has been acknowledged as being one of the most significant contributors, interventionists, activists in achieving social change. The Magsaysay was a recognition not just of the work that she did on the ground, but a recognition of personal commitment when it is combined with collective action. So, shall we say, the personal and the political, which is, of course, the title of her book. And it is a book that is remarkable not just for her journey, but for what it tells us about where we are today and where she was when she started out. So I'm just going to speak to you a little bit about that journey, Aruna. And Maybe we can begin with the title of your book, which is, of course, the feminist slogan of the 60s, 70s, 80s, which refused to separate what is personal. For most women, what was personal was also equated with what was domestic, and the political, which was supposed to be the public. When feminists said that there is no such dichotomy and you cannot compartmentalize the two, it gave rise to this slogan. And Aruna, you have said in your book that your primary identity is a gender identity, and that your feminist consciousness is what has imbued you with the, the strength and the strategies with which you work. I just wanted to ask you, what specifically in this feminism or this feminist consciousness has guided your work across the three areas that we mentioned: civil and political rights, economic rights, and gender rights? What is it specifically about that?
I think my entire perspective has been shaped by my gender. And in a very, not only in the sense of my being physically different, but in the sense of the way my mind works. And I found that from the very beginning, even in the attitude to power, I mean, when I had male colleagues in the Indian Administrative Service, they saw power vested in the power to control.
Yes.
And I saw power vested in the power to give, the power to facilitate, the power to empower, not really in the power to control. And I remember those weary discussions we had when we sat down to have lunch. And every civil servant who was a male civil servant was always boasting about how they ordered firing here or they ordered firing there, how they controlled the mob. Whereas for most women, many women, the issue was how many are hungry, how many children have not going to school, or how many of the people whom we work for do not have the basic amenities. So it began there. But the notion of power, many people have asked me whether I've had what was so crazy about my life that from being so powerful, I should become powerless in a state of diminishing returns, they said, that I was in Delhi, then I went to an NGO, then I went to a people's organization. So I actually work with the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, which is based in a village called Devdungri in Rajasthan, in which we live in a mud hut, even today. We do have electricity, but it's a mud hut. So many people thought that we were just very romantic about it. But the point is that power is not vested either in the big bungalow in Lutyens, Delhi, nor in an NGO, nor even in that hut. But by living in that hut, you really understand the semantics of poverty. You understand the way poverty functions at so many levels, and you feel it on your skin. And I think as a woman, I was very sensitive to that. How do women fetch water? How do they carry? I mean, all this ridiculous idea of toilets, for instance. Every government has said have toilets. And as if it's the worst thing that's happening in India is that we don't have toilets. And in Rajasthan, a woman fetches water on her head from miles away. If we get water once in 5 days. And you can just fill up your water and that's it. For 5 days, there's no water. How do you have a toilet without water? And when they become very insistent in the last 10 years of this recent government, many of my Dalit women friends had to break their kitchens to make them into toilets. And I was aghast.
Okay.
And I said, it was shocking. How can you, in Northi, a very dear friend of mine who's a very big character in this book, who became a Dalit worker, laborer, who became a worker for rights, for civil rights, for democratic rights, became the sarpanch of her village, has now trained herself with the aid of the NGO that she is close to, the Barefoot College, in technology. She works the computer, and she taught her computer worker assistant how to work the computer. She downloaded NREGA lists and made sure that everyone got full work. Now, for instance, a person like Northi still lives in a mud hut. Now, how do you define empowerment? It's a huge issue. So, for me, the definition of power, and I feel I'm very strong because you cannot take it away from me today. I mean, I don't retire from power to powerlessness. You can't take away the darban, you can't take away the chokidar, you can't take away the person at the door. The power is in me and in my capacity to speak truth to power. And if I can speak truth to power, then I remain powerful all my life. It doesn't take it away from me. So that strength and that ability to confront and say things is enormous, and it's freedom. That's real freedom. The day I resigned from the IAS, I thought I went into freedom. I could say what I liked to whoever I liked about whatever I liked with my own sense of the ethics, that ethical world that I understood, with my own priorities. I didn't have to say anything to them to please them or be curbed. Actually, I believe Sainath met me this morning and he said, gagging, what did he say? His topic was something about gagging. And governance through gagging or gagging through governance, I don't know what he told me it was, but we are now gagged. We're a gagged people. We can't say what we want, even in the public domain. Can you imagine? And now you all understand what it means to be gagged. But when you're a civil servant, you're always gagged. You can't say this and you can't say that. If you say this, then you're obstructing somebody. If you say that, then you're contravening some other rule. So it was impossible. Then, of course, it was the fact. That's where, for me, the worlds broke, because I was an urban woman. I'd done English literature. And for me, literature has been and still remains a very important part of my life. I read a lot. So for me, yes, these books have really meant a lot to me. When I saw that I was going to sit in front of these books, it's been a very proud moment for me, because it is a part of my life. And somebody said to me, "Do you still read Shakespeare?" I said, "But why not?" And then when I sit in Devdungri, sometimes there is a BBC program which we get on the radio, which I can hear, of some interpretation of Shakespeare, modern interpretation of Shakespeare. Why not? What forbids my mind from traveling the universe? And what is it that education has given me, not only from schooling, but from the fact that I was born to very literate and progressive parents, the family of very progressive people? What I got inside my head was freedom. Now, that freedom I need to transfer to people. So it is my political freedom, my emotional freedom, my freedom to express myself, my freedom to think. And so whether it's Virginia Woolf, who did something to me, or Mary Wollstonecraft, or Avvai, because I'm a Tamilian, I've heard of poems by Avvai for a long time, or Bharatiyar, or anybody else, or the subaltern poets. For me, it's been a long journey with so many writers. Many of the writers who are here, maybe I've read them all. Malayali writers, fantastic Malayali writers who've changed my mind. I won't go into the listing of the names, then it'll take forever. And I've continually read. And I've read in English because, unfortunately, that's the language I read literature in, though my political language today is Hindi. I speak Hindi and Rajasthani. That's my political language. But my language for reading literature remains, unfortunately, English. The fragility of the local power system, which you mentioned, Ritu, it is very fragile. And fragile, why? Because we don't allow them to express themselves in any way where they can become powerful. So it is making room for that expression that led us all into, they know they're being cheated, they know they are being denied their wages, they know that everything is going wrong, but they can't say it. So that's why the right to information became such an important campaign, and in which we believe that Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, which is the name of my organization where I work, that MKSS began this very strong people's movement for transparency of government and government records. And it really took on like wildfire, because that fragility was completely converted and inverted to become the power of the people to articulate in a democracy. How do you articulate power? How do you articulate demand? How do you articulate the need to access things? So I think it's been both a challenge and a joy. The challenge because it is something which is so difficult and fragile. And a joy because I've always had people like Ritu, Kamla Bhasin, Mamta Jetli, Renuka Pamicha, and a whole host of women who have always been so extraordinarily supportive in whatever way they have, and we've been a solid front. It's not only the village women like Northi and Bila and Mangi and Buria and so many others, but it's been our group of women, middle class women, who the first lot that came in the 60s. And we were a very strong group of women, and we fought for all kinds of rights, social rights, economic rights. So we fought for Dalits, we fought for economic issues, we fought for political issues. So, and a woman's perception of the world is in fact plural. Only one thing I would like to ask you, because I'm actually an activist and incidentally a writer. So how many of you, when you see something terrible happening on the street or in your environment, don't feel a rage or a desire to set it right? How many of you feel it? I can't believe that nobody feels it. Everyone feels it. And the only thing the activist does is act on it. And why is the activist now damned? Damned so terribly. We are called Andolan Jivis, we are called urban Nakshalites, we are called a whole bevy of names. And the only thing that we demand is that the truth be articulated, that the poor get their share. Or in democracy, democracy must work for the most vulnerable.
Only Aruna could have made what I thought was a very straightforward question into something so articulate, so evocative, and so layered in response. And I just want to go back to two things that you said. And they both relate to both the fragility as well as the activism. Many of us who have been working in these areas and working from what we have called the margins, which is to say, we are working in opposition to the mainstream, in opposition to a hierarchy and systemic structures of power. The notion of power and powerlessness is extremely important. We tend to think of powerlessness as as something undesirable and how should I put it, as a state that has no potential. I think that the work that has been done over the decades by people working on rights, whether civil and political or economic or gender, have understood the enormous potential of powerlessness. This is something that Aruna's work, for example, has exemplified. But anyone who has worked on the right to wages, the right to shelter, the right to health, the right to education, anyone who has worked on these rights knows that actually it is only from the margins that you can make these demands. It is only from a position of powerlessness, when you have nothing to lose, that you can articulate and fight and struggle. So now, when it comes to activism, you have said in your memoir that activism for you is a question of politics and ethics. It is a question of being in a position to make for some change. I wanted to ask you, over the last 3 or 4 decades, what are the changes that you have seen in the kind of activism that is taking place today, or say over the last decade or so, and the activism of the 60s, 70s, 80s, which is when the decades that you were the most, how should I put it, driven?
Well, it's been a long journey, but definitely I began life as a person with a great sensitivity to suffering. I could not look at suffering with any kind of tolerance. Whether it was an individual, whether it was a community, and I was born over the cusp of independence. I was in Delhi. My parents were in Delhi. I saw partition. I saw communal killings, not really like that, because my parents wouldn't let me see it. But I heard cries, I heard agony, I heard and felt sorrow. And soon after, Gandhiji was assassinated in Delhi. And I promise you, those of you who listen to propaganda nowadays, that Gandhiji was not a popular person or it was a made up issue or something. He was a popular human being and everybody felt he was a member of their family. So when he died, it was enormous and the tragedy hit the family. And as a young child, I also felt something terrible had happened to this man called Gandhi. So, in a sense, when you grow over all these years, a kind of humane activism was born. And in that one act of assassinating Gandhi, I think India understood that it was extremely important to protect the plurality of India, the plurality and the multiplicity of religions, to make sure that there was no communal killing, that there was secular, that India was a secular state. It was not questioned until, I think, till the mid 70s or early 80s. Early 80s, actually, it began to be questioned. So for us, there was a sense of acceptability. There was terra firma, as they say in Italian. There was firm, the ground was firm. And we knew that we had to build on what was the ground of accepted values. Then you had differences in ideology, you had differences in approach, you had, and even if you look at the look at the Indian movement for independence. There were so many different opinions. They argued, they disagreed, but they did not plan to kill. There was no question of killing. There was dear, very great differences between people. So we grew up listening to these differences. There were arguments in public fora. The arguments were simply normal. I mean, you didn't think that there should be no difference or disagreement or contradictions or even sometimes really what should I say, volatile disagreements. But those disagreements were never seen as a kind of reviling of the state or a kind of villainy or anything. So that slowly has transposed because of many factors. I think one is definitely that our educational system is deteriorated. When we went to school, I think we did not go into a state where we were schooled, we were educated. Now children are schooled. Look at those shops that have come up now, these coaching centers. Children don't go to school because they must learn. They go to school because they must pass a test to qualify for some exam. That's all. It's total marketability. You put in, you invest so much, you get so much, and you realize so much. But in our case, it was not so. We had education. We also had exposure to a lot of political thought from childhood. Whether it was Shankar was the famous Malayali who brought out a great magazine called Shankar's Weekly, which ridiculed and drew cartoons of people in power, including Jawaharlal Nehru, with whom he was friendly. It drew cartoons of everybody. So you saw that, and you didn't think that it was a wrong thing to draw a cartoon of a political leader if you wanted to parody some of his ideas, which you didn't agree with. You might still sympathize with him. So that kind of thing we grew up with, and now in the educational system, and I don't know how many of you in Kerala really feel strongly, but we people in the north who live there in the north feel so strongly that our curricula now is completely mutilated. There, everything has been removed. The Brahmo Samaj has been removed. Raja Ram Mohan Roy has been removed. Mughal period has been removed from history in Maharashtra. And, Darwin has been removed. What are we learning? Can you imagine a schooling where you don't learn about Darwin? I mean, I'm not a student of science, but can I not know about Darwin, survive as a modern person? So the kind of education that we had was one and the media was the other. I won't go into the media because everybody talks about it.
And the context that you mentioned earlier of accepted values and of an acceptance of people who worked on those values. So that is what characterized that period, those early decades. And now, of course, even activism has come under such stress, and it has become more and more difficult for people even to be working on the fundamental rights, forget all the others. But I wanted to ask you, you have mentioned, of course, a great deal about Gandhi. So do you feel that you subscribe to the values that he was so resolute about as being essential to both independence and human dignity and progress, which is seva, nirman, and sangharsh? Do you subscribe to those values?
You see, he was a very practical man. I think none of his views they came from any great theorizing. I think he just saw what people did.
Yes.
And all of us distribute ourselves into three kinds of public work and public action. Some of us do service. We know whether you like to distribute blankets to people or there's a typhoon. Wayanad had this disaster. So everybody rushes in with stuff so that they can live better. Then you have the strugglers, and then you have the people who want to build houses for them, build everything for them. That's development. Then you have the third category, which is why did Wayanad get those? Why did Wayanad mountains and the rainfall affect people? What is the policy of the government of Kerala or the government of India which causes our natural disasters? So these are three things we do, all of us do. He only put them into words.
Yes.
And I think, therefore, how can you quarrel with him? But I do quarrel with him, and I want to know
No,
where
not
I
quarrel,
do.
but do you actively work with them?
Yes, I do. How can you not? When you live in a village and there's a woman next door who's got a terrible delivery, she's got a breech delivery. You just have to rush her to hospital. At that time, you can't talk about, oh, you should have had a very good hospital in this place, and then now you should go and protest against to the collector to get a good hospital. First thing you do is get the baby out healthy. Make sure that she doesn't die because of the breech delivery. And then you start talking about why there should be a hospital. And then you start talking about why policies should be changed with the government. If you don't begin with actually what is and what is really affecting them at that moment, you can never really get to the point where they will get into a point of struggle. So all three things, but I have a lot of other quarrels with Gandhiji.
We all do. But I'm saying that there are some of these values that are now, being discounted. And it's for that reason that I asked whether they still hold the kind of significance that I think we need to return to in a way. So
We need to return to Gandhi for 2-3 things which are critical for me. One is the anti-communal position that we want today. He was a man who was religious but talked about secularism.
Yes.
There's so much confusion in northern India that if you say you're secular, they think you're an atheist. Or if you say that you're a believer, then they think you're a communalist. But these words are very different and the meanings are so different. So we need to understand that you can be religious, you can believe in something, have faith in something, and still believe that the state should be secular. At the same time, you also know that religion means something to 98% of our people. So what do you do? So in the School for Democracy with which we work now in a very large scale, we've taken the constitution and the concept of religion to people and the concept of secularism, that you have faith. A good Hindu or a good Muslim or a good Christian or a good Jew or a good Jain or a good Buddhist or a good Sikh will only say, I believe in my religion, will not say destroy others because my religion is more or bigger than them. So long as there's equality of all religions, you choose your faith, you believe in it, you do whatever you like. But the moment you ask for someone to be killed because they belong to another faith, then you tread beyond your rights and your freedom into a kind of screwing up of the Constitution's right, basic right to fundamental right to practice all religions. So this explanation had to be real, and I still think many people don't understand. So you have to go into these details, and I think there he was very shrewd. I don't agree with his economic policies because I don't think self-reliance and Ram Rajya are very easy to get.
but you mentioned one other that you thought was very important. What about non-violence?
Totally. Coming from the first argument is non-violence.
Yes.
And it's a non-violence and the mode of protest. He did both. He said that there was a right to protest, but he said it should be non-violent protest. Both these things are very important. Now, today in India, we all, no matter whether we are left, center, right, whether we are activist or whether we are any other formist, we all only practice non-violent protest. Because otherwise you're in jail. Even when you don't do it, well, for me, Sai Baba comes to my mind because he's just died. A person with 90% disability was put in jail for 10 years because he had a mind which thought in a way that the government didn't like. You know, if you start controlling people's minds, we are in literature, we are in 1984, we are in Brave New World and all those, dystopias that were written, which frightened us into so much worry. But we are living those dystopias now.
But non-violence not just as a strategic option, but as a value. What I'm saying is that there are those who believe in a just war, for example. There are those who believe that some violence is justified. But I think, at least as a feminist and as somebody who has made that a part of your not just your consciousness but your work, it has to be based on a non-violent a non-violent dealing with issues, dealing with oppression, dealing with structural injustice. I don't know that one can choose violence as an option. There's one particular aspect of in your memoir that I found that I think would be interesting for people to hear about. You work in Rajasthan. You have been there now for over 40 years, and in villages, as you say. And we know that for a fact that Rajasthan has had some extremely progressive social movements. They had the Women's Development Program. They have had the Barefoot College, SWRC, which Pankaj started in the early 70s. They were extremely important in conceptualizing the Mahila Samakhya program, which was education for women's equality, which completely rewrote what education should be and what it must be for those who are powerless. What explains this sort of impulse in Rajasthan for these very strong social movements and for your own work to be located there and to be so profound in its impact? What is it about Rajasthan that has enabled this?
It's a question that has baffled me. But before that, I'll make just one line of a statement about war and peace. I think there is no just war. So far as I'm concerned, there's only peace and there is dialogue and there is a space that is there for settling discord. As a feminist, I would say, we were not only for equality, we pursued equality with peace. We had an international vision and a dream of peace in the world and not war. So having said that, let me come to this. Rajasthan, it's interesting that Rajasthan jumped from feudalism into modernity. The British Raj did not interfere with their administration. So in this leap from feudalism into modernity, it left a lot of space. This is my analysis, I may be wrong. It left a lot of space for all of us who are democratic to go in when democracy was beginning to give land to everybody, to the tiller. There was, more voices for the Dalits, more voices for everybody. Yet the there was a somewhat similar and shared culture also that carried on. In terms of music, they shared a lot. In terms of many other things, they shared a lot. So you could make that space. I mean, if we had started the Right to Information movement in Andhra, for instance, all my Andhra friends who are human rights activists used to say, how did you manage it in Rajasthan? In Andhra, you would have been killed. Or how did you manage it? Many friends have asked. So it gave us that democratic space, which was ignorance. So the democratic ignorance gave us the space to march into that space. What I think we did, the whole lot of activists in Rajasthan, women's activists and other democratic activists and civil rights activists, that we took advantage of that historic moment and walked into that space. Today in Rajasthan, it will be more difficult because the Hindutva has gone in and very cleverly twisted faith to become communal. I'm making these two words, and I know Keralites are very intelligent people, and you will deal with it. And you must write to me if you feel that there is something further that one can engage with. That faith is not necessarily communal. After all, you have in Kerala great institutions of faith. You have the church, you have Hindu temples, you have Muslims, dargahs, and other places. You even have a synagogue. So it's not as if Kerala has shorn itself of its religious texture. But in your political work and in your public work, religion doesn't come in. It's a private area. So I think so far, I think encroachments are being made. So that was the space we fought for and got.
This is very interesting, this comment that you make about transition from feudal to democratic, because of course one doesn't ever think of democratic ignorance as being a space for some kind of revolutionary or radical change. And that is, I suppose, something that one should think about much more deeply. I'm going to move away for a moment from the political and get to the personal. I have always had a very great admiration of people, and particularly of women who write their autobiography or their memoir. And the question that I'm going to end with is, well, two questions really. Is there something that you wanted to write about and didn't in the book? And is there a decision that you took in your life that you deeply regret?
I made a decision that I would write about the personal and the political, but not about the private. And I'm not unhappy I did that. I just don't want to discuss all the various things of what happened between my mother and me in detail and go into a saga of despair, or between husband and wife or wife and father. I didn't want to get into that. I wanted to deal with the personal and the political. So please understand that there is a private, the personal, and the political. As a right to information activist, I fight for the right to privacy. But I fight for the right to access all information as well. There is public information and there is information which we need full access to. But there are areas in which we want to be private, and that privacy must be respected. What is violated in terms of our privacy, we all know. I don't have to go into detail. And as a woman, I also felt that we don't want revenge. We want justice. Please don't confuse justice with revenge. Men want revenge much more than women want revenge, as a general rule. I'm sure there are many women who want revenge and many men who don't want revenge. But the moment you want revenge, you go into a scene and it's a vicious cycle and you end up somewhere else. So these are all arguments that I had in my head, but which I didn't have a great deal of space to write about. And actually this book was 1/3 more, and I have cut off many pages because I thought it was just went on and on. So there are those hacked off pages which deal with details rather than the issues. And of course it's also there, but regrets in my life for what I could have done which I didn't, not really, because I think I was blessed with the upbringing with which my father said to me always that you must do what you think is right and you mustn't be afraid. So my parents had an argument about us children when we were born I was born in the late 40s. So they had an argument. My father was then an atheist and my mother was she was neither a believer or not believer. She was an agnostic. So they discussed, what do you do with children? Because it was immediately after partition and after these killings. What do the children do? Do we bring them up religious or unreligious, or don't talk about it, talk about it? My father said, just don't talk about anything. But my mother was a student of mathematics and physics from Tamil Nadu. She was a very rational human being, and she said, no, my children shouldn't have fear. She said, what causes all these killings is fear. The first thing, and you know from our immediate environment in politics today, that fear is the basis of hate. Fear is the basis of killings. Fear is the basis of non-violence. It's the basis of everything. So my mother said, my children should not grow up in fear. So she exposed us to all religions. So we learned about every religion. And I even now remember my father came to Kerala as a government servant many years ago in the 50s, and he brought a beautiful figure of Christ. as a gift to all of us to put up when we did our Christmas celebrations. So it was everything. That liberty is something very, very precious. And what I regret very greatly today, not that it's my choice, but it's a choice beyond me, the loss of that kind of feeling where the sacred was not my sacred, but was a sacred for, it could have been politics, it could have been Marx, it could have been anybody, it could have been Bhagat Singh, it could have been anybody that I felt, or Rabindranath Tagore, it could have been anybody, but that I had the right to have that sacred space and that it should not be questioned. If that had been respected, all these people would not have been imprisoned. Sudha Bharadwaj, after all, what were they doing? They were just amplifying the voices of poverty and of pain. But they were just nailed because they had, their notion of sacred was different. Sacred doesn't only mean God. It means something, a space which we feel is non-negotiable in our lives. It can be political space, it can be religious space, it can be emotional space. And that, I think, as women, we have fought for. We've fought for emotional space. We don't have time, but Ritu had just mentioned the women's programs. In that, we fought for emotional
Yes,
space.
exactly.
We fought for emotional space. We said we have a right to that emotional space. No one is going to tell us you can't cry, you can't do this, you can't do that. That emotional space is mine. And it's my idea of freedom. And I have full control over it.
On that note, which is very uplifting and also very positive and very aspirational, maybe we can open it up to some questions from the audience, if there are any to that. I see one hand up already. Go ahead, but you need a mic perhaps.
Thank you for the wonderful conversation. One very intriguing thread, which perhaps I would like to be amplified, is your disagreement with Gandhiji's way of looking at the world.
I didn't disagree with everything he said. I think everybody has to be logically questioned at some points. I mean, if I follow Ambedkar, it doesn't mean I'm blind about Ambedkar. If I agree with Gandhi, it doesn't mean I'm blind about Gandhi. If I agree with Marx, it doesn't mean I'm blind about Marx. The ability of a rational individual to question anything and everything where it is disagreeable is our right. I mean, why should I agree with everything Gandhiji said? Why should I agree with everything Marx said, or everything Jawaharlal Nehru said, or anybody, Bhagat Singh said, or anybody, or Ambedkar said? Though I mind you, Ambedkar has fashioned my life more than Gandhi, because I live in Ambedkar's world of the Constitution. He has in fact shaped my life. My public life is shaped by both Gandhi and Ambedkar in equal proportion. If it weren't for Ambedkar, I wouldn't be here with you today. I'm here because of Ambedkar. So they both fashioned my life, but I question and I have the right to question them. And this kind of blindness that we have, we make everyone into a god and pray to them, is ridiculous. That's where I said I do have objections to even film stars in my state in Tamil Nadu become gods.
I mean, Aruna did say that she disagreed with his economic views and self-reliance and Ram Rajya and all of that. So partly, I suppose that's a reservation that all of us have. Although I do have to say that I have heard a very brilliant discussion of Gandhi's resistance to Marx's Capital by Akhil Belgrami, in which he explained what he meant by peasant economy. So that's another discussion. But any more questions?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I was listening you, and you were talking about Mahatma Gandhi. You said that Mahatma Gandhi was so religious, and same time he was secular. But today's context, you know that I think you might have said on the basis of North Indian. You said yourself living in. No, she was saying you are living in. You are living in Rajasthan. Today, for example, if you are a religious, you should be a communal. In your statement, you said. No, that was a perception
I
you
didn't
said.
say that. I said today they interpret religion as communal. I didn't say they.
No. I'm not quoting your word. You said as a example. No. Yeah, okay. I agree with you. What you said, I understood what you were saying. So in that context, actually, and you were talking about Kerala also. Like Kerala is an example. There, even people are religious. There is, we have a Padmanabha temple. So many religious places. For all the religious, we have a temple, mosque, and church. And we people are very religious, and the religion is a personal affairs. Whereas in North, I was referring Kerala, maybe you know that communication gap. Why this communal politic associated with the religion? Is it because of the that vested interest, like you know that today the capitalism, there is a connection between the capitalism and the ruling government, and same time you know that the communalism is a tool in order to divide the people. So in that context, do you think that is it because of the political is it because of the political idea, or because of the you know the people mindset, or there is no proper education? So what is the reason you are thinking?
I think religion is being used by politics. I think all of us will agree today that religion is being used by politics as a tool to first build fear, then to invoke hate, and then to that to be converted into violence, and that to be converted into the concept of an unequal society. The moment you create the concept of an unequal society, you cease to be democratic. If the constitution doesn't give us all equal right to worship, all equal right to pray, all equal right to create institutions of education with under different religious entities, today the Waqf board, which is the Muslim board, which owns property, is under huge threat in Delhi. Now I think, why target only the Waqf board? Why not all the temples? Why not all the churches? Everybody. Question all the religions if you must. Why do you pick up only one religion? On what grounds? So that kind of inequality is totally Ambedkar. But it also has the consent of Gandhi, who never said in his prayer meetings, he had all religious prayers of all the various religions sung in his prayer meeting. He didn't have one religion sung at all. So in that sense, the concept of secularism was shared by Jawaharlal Nehru, by Mahatma Gandhi, by Rabindranath Tagore, by even Sardar Patel. He didn't have a view of a Hindutva India. They may have held very different opinions. Nehru was an atheist. Gandhi was a believer. But they all held, and Ambedkar, of course, they all held, and Ambedkar has very strong sets of belief, but they all agreed that for India to survive, it should be a secular country.
There was a question there, I think. Yeah.
It's a great pleasure to see some women who is speaking politics. Thank you for that. And my question is that, and I read some newspapers that in Rajasthan, that the newborn babies are providing horoscope by government freely. Is it correct? Or and all the astrologers are paid by government. Some newspapers had given that the hospitals and the newborn babies are given free horoscopes. And all an activist, what's your opinion on this? I read this and I went to Rajasthan. I found that astrologers are paid by government. So as an activist and a feminist, what's your opinion? So that's
Actually, there's a very important political word called Sanskritization. And Sanskritization has been used systematically to Hinduize tribal communities, to tribal Dalits, to get OBCs into the fold where the Brahmin still holds control. Now that Brahmin is now part of a political system called Hindutva. So they're using that system to create a social milieu, and this is where I think the rest of India, I don't know about Kerala quite, but the rest of India, we made a huge mistake that we have not gone into the culture of equality amongst religions. We have not gone into the culture of celebration amongst religions. Even activists only took up the rights and went home.
Absolutely.
We never ever discussed why should you do, how do you celebrate Eid, how do you celebrate Diwali, how do you celebrate Christmas. For us now, it's critically important that we do, and therefore, how do you celebrate birthdays? Why do you need astrologers? Why do you need an astrologer? But let me tell you that we people have really completely destroyed rural India and particularly rural Rajasthan, where when I went to Rajasthan 50 years ago, they didn't know when they were born. You asked anybody a date of birth, they said, Pata nahi hai. We don't know. Today, young people are celebrating their birthdays and spending, poor families are spending 10, 20, 30,000 rupees, and there's a birthday cake. For heaven's sake, why do you need a birthday cake? And why in a vegetarian Rajasthan, they're willing to make only a concession for the egg in the cake and for nothing else? Why don't they eat a daily egg and improve their health? They don't do, but the cake in the egg is okay. So there are questions we have to raise. And that's why I feel that cultural politics is critically important. And therefore, we must question them as to why this horoscope is important, why this so-and-so is important. And we must all do it. And I think, but I want to frankly ask you, how many of you still believe in horoscopes? And why is it in the newspaper, that little column that comes, which tells you that Pisces and this one and Scorpio? How many of you read it?
And
To know what the next week
how
is
many
like.
of you say which zodiac sign have you been born under?
Sorry? Yeah, of course. It is interesting, it's curious, you can read it. The point of the whole thing is that we must bring it into our own lives. No politics will work unless, in this again, we go back to that we must actually do what we want others to do. We have to live like them to prove that it is possible. We have to be like them. And that's why social work and social activism is so difficult. Because you cannot be an off and on, like a switch, put it on and put it off. The last thing I'd say is, I read a very interesting article in one of the New York papers. I think it was the New York Herald or New York Tribune or New York Times. I can't remember now. But there was a very interesting article written about 5, 6 years ago by a Chinese American, that the two things that kill any kind of change today are convenience and comfort. For convenience, we'll do anything. By the way, we are the objectors to the Aadhaar. You know, we filed a case in the Supreme Court, which we lost, about the Aadhaar. Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan and Nikhil Dey and Aruna Roy filed a case against the Aadhaar. And today you see, I'm coming from Rajasthan, because poor people don't have the fingerprints, because of that whole digitization, lakhs of people who deserve the pension, poor people's pension, are not getting it. Elderly pension, they're not getting disability pensions, because you can just, a digital operator can ruin your life. By removing your name, you are no longer alive. So therefore, you don't have access to your bank account, you don't have access to any services, nothing. So battles have to be fought. So why? But when I look at that thing about the digital thing, I'm thinking of my ATM card. I'm thinking of, oh, how easy it is to book my train ticket or my, plane ticket. Oh, I think let's avoid, let those people fight it. We just continue with this because it's convenient. And I do know about comfort. None of us ever join people who are sitting in Dharna, at least in Delhi, in Jantar Mantar, to say, okay, we agree with you. We can't do anything much, but we'll feed you once. We'll give you water or we'll give you shelter. Only place which gives us shelter and food is the Gurdwara. The Gurdwara gives us langar. We can go and sit there and eat with them, and they give us space to sleep. But we had to fight with the government of India when they declared Jantar Mantar a non-space. So the MKSS went and filed a writ to get that space for public protest. We've said over and over again that the people who are in position have parliament, have policy rooms. The people only have the street. So it's our parliament, it's our policy room, it's our room for debate and disagreement. Everything is the street. And if you don't allow a space on the street, then we don't have anything. So space on the street is a big issue of politics. And therefore, struggle is a very important part of life. Public struggle is an important part of life. And that space in Jantar Mantar we've got back because of a fairly decent but not fully decent Supreme Court order. But we are now like government officers. We have to go there at 10 and leave at 5. This is ridiculous. And we bring people from all over northern India, very poor people who have no place to stay. Previously, we just slept there and got up there, but now we can't do that. So in a democracy, you have to battle all these issues out. And then, because nothing is untouched by democracy. And that's why democracy and the constitution are the most important frame within which all public action today is housed. With Gandhi's suggestions and values, but their broad frame is the constitution, and the constitution is being steadily undermined by lateral laws being passed, the CAA being passed, all kinds of the DG, the information thing that has now been passed. Everything is cutting the roots of our rights. If we don't watch out, we'll lose them. And if we lose these rights, we lose everything. So the constitution is an extremely important frame. And that first preamble is my prayer that we get liberty, equality, and fraternity. Is my prayer that we live equally, is my prayer. And that is my prayer. It may not be anybody else's prayer, but it's my prayer. That is the most important thing. And I don't want that sacred space to be destroyed. Others don't want others to be destroyed. I don't want that sacred space to be destroyed. I want the constitution. I want the preamble. I want the chapter on fundamental rights. I want the chapter on, every single chapter that's there. Amend what is wrong or what is outdated. But please don't destroy the constitution.
Thank you, Anurag. Thank you for that. Thank you for that wonderfully rousing, inspiring, powerful, and positive statement of your life and work. Thank you.